Okay. I guess I'll just up and ready. Oh, I forgot to mute myself. There we go. Hold on. There we go. I'm muted everywhere now, so there's no feedback. None of that'll be an issue. All right, so I guess maybe I should change the tags. I've got English and IRL are all the tags I need. I don't need to change any of that for reading a book. All right, so this is going to be a real simple stream. I'm just going to read through the book. Not going to interact too much with the chat or anything, but just a little experimental kind of thing to try something slightly different from the news. This is not a current events or anything. This is just me reading a pretty old book. When was this? It was like 1920 or something, I think. Oh, not 1930. Off by a decade. So I'm just going to try to blast through this, sort of see how far I can get. Hey Jules, I see you there, but I think your audio, you said your audio's off. All right, we got a few people in here though. That's cool. Don't feel any need to like hang around or whatever or comment, because I'm probably not going to read too much of the chat. But oh, cool, you can't hear me. I'm not going to stop a whole lot to do commentary and stuff, because I've got, this is a few pages to read. It's like, I don't know. I'm on page 3453 of the document, so it's 19 pages, something. Yeah, so like 20 pages to read, not really long, but, I don't think I'm going to have a whole lot of time to give color commentary, especially since it's only like a couple hours before the discussion that we're going to have later on this. But I don't know, maybe this would be a taste for some people who weren't in the reading group. I linked it in the YouTube thread where I posted this, so if anybody's interested, I think that the link to the Matrix is there. But we convene every week to read some stuff related to Marx and also continental philosophy. So far we've gone through Theses on Feuerbach by Marx, Engels's The End of Classical German Philosophy, or Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Philosophy, which kind of goes through the development of Marx's materialism with respect to German idealism through Feuerbach and Hegel. Oh yeah, I will drop I'll drop the link to the thread in the chat. Let's see. I think I closed the thread actually. Here we go. Yeah, I should have thought to do that. Yeah, here's the thread. I'll put that in the side tube, and you can go from there. I think that the Matrix link is on there. If not, you can ask for it. Somebody will post it. I'm not going to grab the Matrix link right now, but yeah. Let me just pop out the YouTube chat really quick, just in case anybody posts something there. All right. Yeah, and I don't think I'm going to do a whole lot of conversing with the audience. Oh wait, let me catch up. Theses on Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Philosophy. Then we read Critique of the Gotha Program. I need to actually check. I have the list. There was another one in there before we got here. Oh, it was Heidegger. That's right. Where are they? Check my notes. Yeah, Age of the World Picture by Heidegger, and currently we're on Civilization and Its Discontents by Sigmund Freud. This is going to be the last week that we're discussing that before we move on to something else. I don't know if we've decided what yet, but next week will be something different. So yeah, I'm just going to go ahead and get started reading. Looks like we got some viewers in here who might be interested. Let's see how this goes. I have not done a regular old just textual reading before, so we'll see how far I can get. Might also be a bit of a test run for when I try to marathon Capital later on as a joke. All right, so this is an 8-chapter book. It's pretty short, closer to like a pamphlet, I guess. And basically, the gist so far is that Freud has been kind of trying to psychoanalyze human civilizations, which is to say, like Western civilization, Europe, and understand why people aren't happy in it, and sort of the underlying psychological forces that cause people to interact with society the way that they do. It's, he's kind of like Joker posting, right? This is Freud's version of we live in a society. That's sort of the deal here. And he's laid out some groundwork before this, some context that's going to be missing because I'm starting at the end here, but it might still be pretty coherent because Freud writes in a way that's fairly cogent. So let's see. There we go. Make it easier, a little easier to see. And I think I will. There we go. See the hamstick in the chat. We need a something like that to do with the little emotes. I'd love to get the chat emotes to pop up like the Twitch ones do. But yeah, this is a pretty good text to be reading for the far left, I think. There's certainly things to criticize about it, but largely that's because science only knew so much at the time. Anyway. Ooh. All right. So here I go with Freud. In none of my previous writings have I had so strong a feeling as now that what I am describing is common knowledge, and that I am using up paper and ink and, in due course, the compositors' and printers' work and material in order to expound things which are, in feet, self-evident. For that reason, I should be glad to seize the point if it were to appear that the recognition of a special, independent aggressive instinct means an alteration of the psychoanalytic theory of the instincts. So he's trying to contextualize, like, aggressiveness, but he's worried that what he's going to say is too obvious. We shall see, however, that this is not so, and it is merely a matter of bringing into sharper focus a turn of thought that arrived at long ago, and of following out of its consequences. Of all the slowly developed parts of the analytic theory, the theory of the instincts is the one that has felt its way the most painfully forward. And yet that theory was so indispensable that the whole structure that something had to be put in its place. In what was at first my utter perplexity, I took as my starting point a saying of the poet-philosopher Schiller that hunger and love are what moves the world. Hunger could be taken to represent the instincts which aim at preserving the individual, while love strives after objects, and its chief function, favored in every way by nature, is the preservation of the species. Thus, to begin with, ego instincts and object instincts confronted each other. It was to denote the energy of the latter, and only the latter instincts, that I introduced the term libido. Thus, the antithesis was between the ego instincts and the libidinal instincts of love, in its widest sense, which were directed to an object. One of these object instincts, the sadistic instinct, stood out from the rest, it is true, in that its aim was so very far from being loving. Moreover, it was obviously in some respects attached to the ego instincts. It could not hide its close affinity with instincts of mastery which have no libidinal purpose. For these discrepancies were got over. After all, sadism was clearly a part of sexual life, in the activities of which affection could be replaced by cruelty. Neurosis was regarded as the outcome of a struggle between the interest of self-preservation and the demands of the libido. A struggle in which the ego has been victorious, but at the price of severe sufferings and renunciations. Every analyst will admit that even today this view has not the sound of a long-discarded error. Nevertheless, alterations in it became essential as our inquiries advanced from the repressed to the repressing forces, from the object instincts to the ego. The decisive step forward was the introduction of the concept of narcissism. That is to say, the discovery that the ego itself is cathected within libido, that the ego indeed is the libido's original home, and remains to some extent its headquarters. This narcissistic libido turns toward objects, and thus becomes object libido, and it can change back into narcissistic libido once more. The concept of narcissism made it possible to obtain an analytic understanding of the traumatic neuroses and of many of the affections bordering on the psychoses, as well as of the latter themselves. It was not necessary to give up our interpretation of the transference neuroses as attempts made by the ego to defend itself against sexuality, but the concept of libido was endangered. Since the ego instincts too were libidinal, it seems for a tune inevitable that we should make libido coincide with the instinctual energy in general, as Carl Jung said, had already advanced earlier. Nevertheless, there remained in me a kind of conviction for which I was not as yet able to find reasons, that the instincts could not all be of the same kind. My next step was taken in Beyond the Pleasure Principle in 1920, when the compulsion to repeat and the conservative character of instinctual life first attracted my attention. Starting from speculations on the beginning of life, and from biological parallels, I drew the conclusion that besides the instinct to preserve living substance and to enjoy it, and to join it into ever larger units, there must exist another contrary instinct seeking to dissolve those units and to bring them back to their primeval inorganic state. That is to say, as well as Eros, there was an instinct of death. The phenomena of life could be explained from the concurrent mutually opposing action of these two instincts. It was not easy, however, to demonstrate the activities of the supposed death instinct. The manifestations of Eros were conspicuous and noisy enough. It might be assumed that the death instinct operated silently within the organism toward its dissolution, but that, of course, was not proof. A more fruitful idea was that a portion of the instinct is diverted toward the external world and comes to light as an instinct of aggressiveness and destructiveness. In this way, the instinct itself could be pressed into the service of Eros, and that the organism was destroying some other thing, whether animate or inanimate, instead of destroying its own self. Conversely, any restriction of this aggressiveness diverted toward outwards would be bound to increase the self-destruction, which is in any case proceeding. At the same time, one can suspect from this example that the two kinds of instincts seldom, perhaps never, appear in isolation from each other, but are alloyed with each other in very different proportions, so become unrecognizable to our judgment. In sadism, long since known to us as a component instinct of sexuality, we should have before us a particularly strong alloy of this kind between trends of love and the destructive instinct, while its counterpart, masochism, would be a union of destructiveness directed inwards in sexuality. A union which makes what is otherwise an imperceptible trend into a conspicuous and tangible one. So here, it's pretty long and technical, but he's basically saying that they had trouble fitting these things together in a coherent framework. And he has kind of a sort of dialectical mindset where he thinks that there has to be some sort of counterpoint, a push in a different direction for this life-based instincts, which would be the death drive. But yeah, none of that was really established earlier in this text. That's more like broader Freud stuff, but anyway. The assumption of the existence of an instinct of death or destruction has met with resistance even in analytic circles. I am aware that that there is a frequent inclination rather to ascribe what is dangerous and hostile in love to an original bipolarity in its own nature. To begin with, it was only tentatively that I put forth the views I have developed here, but in the course of time they have gained such a hold upon me that I can no longer think in any other way. To my mind, they are far more serviceable from a theoretical standpoint than any other possible ones. They provide that simplification without either ignoring or doing violence to the facts for which we strive in scientific work. I know that in sadism and masochism we have always seen before us manifestations of the destructive instinct directed toward outwards and inwards, strongly alloyed with eroticism, but I can no longer understand how we can have overlooked the ubiquity of non-erotic aggressivity and destructiveness, and can have failed to give it its due place in our interpretation of life. The desire for destruction, when it is directed inwards, mostly eludes our perception, of course, unless it is tinged with eroticism, or erotism. I remember my own defensive attitude with the idea of instinct of destruction first emerged in psychoanalytic literature, and how long it took before I became receptive to it. That others should have shown and still show the same attitude of rejection surprises me less. Actually, there we go. Don't want to block the text. Here we are. For little children do not like it when there is talk of the inborn human inclination to badness, to aggressiveness and destructiveness, and so to cruelty as well. God has made them in the image of his own perfection. Nobody wants to be reminded how hard it is to reconcile the undeniable existence of evil, despite the protestations of Christian science, with his all-powerful, or his all-goodness, or his all-powerfulness, or his all-goodness. The devil would be at best a way out as an excuse for God, in the way that he would be playing the same part as an agent of economic discharge as the Jew does in the world of the Aryan ideal. Remember, this is 1930s Germany, or this is 1930 in Germany. But even so, one can hold God responsible for the existence of the devil just as well as for the existence of the wickedness which the devil embodies. In view of these difficulties, each of us will be well advised on some suitable occasion to make a low bow to the deeply moral nature of mankind. It will help us to be generally popular. It will help us to be generally popular, and much will be forgiven us for it. He's basically saying, do that cynically. And the footnote here, in Goethe's Mephistopheles, we have a quite exceptionally convincing identification of the principle of evil with the destructive instinct. It's there in German, and the English translation is, "For all the things from the void called forth deserve to be destroyed. Thus all which you as sin have rated, destruction all with evil blent. That is my proper element." The devil himself names as his adversary not what is holy and good, but nature's power to create, to multiply life. That is Eros. And it's in German, and then there's the English translation. "From water, earth, and air unfolding, 1,000 germs break forth and grow. In dry and wet and warm and chilly, and had I not the flame reserved, why really, there's nothing special of my own to show." I feel like it would work better if there was more context from the whole work, but I think that the point's still pretty clear. The name libido can once more be used to denote the manifestations of the power of Eros in order to distinguish them from the energy of the death instinct. It must be confessed that we have much greater difficulty in grasping that instinct. We can only suspect it, as it were, as something in the background behind Eros, and it escapes detection unless its presence is betrayed by its being alloyed with Eros. In its sadism, it is in sadism where the death instinct twists the erotic aim in its own sense, and yet at the same time fully satisfies the erotic urge, that we succeed in obtaining the clearest insight into its nature and its relation to Eros. But even when it emerges without any sexual purpose, in the blindest fury of destructiveness, we cannot fail to recognize that the satisfaction of the instinct is accompanied by an extraordinarily high degree of narcissistic enjoyment, owing to its presenting the ego with a fulfillment of the latter's old wishes for omnipotence. The instinct of destruction, moderated and tamed, as it were, inhibited in its aim, must, when it is directed towards objects, provide the ego with the satisfaction of its vital needs and with control over nature. Since the assumption of the existence of the instinct is mainly based on theoretical grounds, we must also admit that it is not entirely proof against theoretical objections. But this is how things appear to us now, in the present state of our knowledge. Future research and reflection will no doubt bring further light, which will decide the matter. So, important point here, and something that tends to be glossed over with Freud, is that he's well aware that he's sort of in the realm of speculation with this. This is a hypothesis. It's a guess. It's an educated guess, but it's a guess. And he's fully aware of this, open about it, and willing to brook criticism, especially in the future with more knowledge. In all that follows, I adopt the standpoint, therefore, that the inclination to aggression is an original self-subsisting instinctual disposition in man, and I return to my view that it constitutes the greatest impediment to civilization. At one point in the course of this inquiry, I was led to the idea that civilization was a special process which mankind undergoes, and I am still under the influence of that idea. I may now add that civilization is a process in the service of Eros, whose purpose is to combine single human individuals, and after that families, then races, peoples, and nations, into one great unity, the unity of mankind. Why this has to happen we do not know. The work of Eros is precisely this. These collections of men are to be libidinally bound to one another. Necessity alone, advantages of work in common, will not hold them together. I don't know about that. But man's natural aggressive instinct, the hostility of each against all, and of all against each, opposes this program of civilization. The aggressive instinct is the derivative and the main representative of the death instinct, which we have found alongside of Eros, and which shares world dominion with it. And now, I think, the meaning of the evolution of civilization is no longer obscure to us. It must present the struggle between Eros and death, between the instinct of life, Orid, the instinct of the, maybe that is a word, Orid or maybe a mid, the instinct of destruction, and it works itself out in the human species. The struggle is what all life essentially consists of, and the evolution of civilization may therefore be simply described as the struggle for life of the human species. Footnote there. And it is this battle of the giants that our nursemaids try to appease with their lullaby about heaven. Note here says, and we may probably add more precisely, a struggle for life in the shape it was bound to assume after a certain event which still remains to be discovered. Just like pointing out that civilization in his sense here is rather particular and not entirely sure why it's defined in this particular way as opposed to another. Chapter 7. Chapter 7. Why do our relatives, the animals, not exhibit any such cultural struggle? Here's where the science comes in. There are societies and cultures and social species, but this might start getting into some things that are a little bit off. I mean, he already had some things to say here that were kind of outmoded, but this might be where it kicks into higher gear. We do not know. Very probably some of them, the bees, the ants, the termites, strove for thousands of years before they arrived at the state institutions, the distribution of functions, and the restrictions on the individual for which we admire them today. It is a mark of our present condition that we know from our own feelings that we should not think ourselves happy in any of these animal states, or in any of the roles assigned in them to the individual. In the case of other animal species, it may be that a temporary balance has been reached between the influences of their environment and the mutually contending instincts within them, and that thus a cessation of development has come about. It may be that in primitive man a fresh access of libido kindled a renewed burst of activity on the part of the destructive instinct. There are a great many questions here to which as yet there is no answer. That comma does not belong there. Another question concerns us more clearly. What means does civilization employ in order to inhibit the aggressiveness which opposes it, to make it harmless, to get rid of it, perhaps? We have already become acquainted with a few of these methods, but not yet with the one that appears to be the most important. This we can study in the history of the development of the individual. What happens in him to render his desire for aggression innocuous? Something very remarkable, which we should never have guessed, and which is nevertheless quite obvious. His aggressiveness is introjected, internalized. It is, in point of fact, sent back to where it came from. That is, it is directed toward his own ego. There it is taken over by a portion of the ego which sets itself over against the rest of the ego as superego, and which now, in the form of conscience, is ready to put into action against the ego the same harsh aggressiveness that the ego would have liked to satisfy upon other extraneous individuals. The tension between the harsh superego and the ego that is subjected to it is called by us the sense of guilt. It expresses itself as a need for punishment. Civilization, therefore, obtains mastery over the individual's dangerous desires for aggression by weakening and disarming it, and by setting up an agency within him to watch over it, like a garrison in a conquered city. As to the origin of this sense of guilt, the analyst has different views from other psychologists, but even he does not find it easy to give an account of it. To begin with, if we ask how a person comes to have a sense of guilt, we arrive at an answer which cannot be disputed. A person feels guilty, devout people would say sinful, when he has done something which he knows to be bad. But then we notice how little this answer tells us. Perhaps after some hesitation we shall add that even when a person has not actually done the bad thing, but has only recognized in himself an intention to do it, he may regard himself as guilty. And the question then arises of why the intention is regarded as equal to the deed. Both cases, however, presuppose that one had already recognized that which is bad, is reprehensible, is something that must not be carried out. How is this judgment arrived at? We may reject the existence of the original, as it were, natural capacity to distinguish good from bad. What is bad is often not at all what is injurious or dangerous to the ego. On the contrary, it may be something which is desirable and enjoyable to the ego. Here, therefore, there is an extraneous influence at work, and it is this that decides what is to be called good or bad. Since a person's own feelings would not have led him along this path, he must have had a motive for submitting to this extraneous influence. Such a motive is easily discovered in his helplessness and his dependence on other people, and it can best be designated as fear of loss of love. Fear of loss of love. If he loses the love of another person upon whom he is dependent, he also ceases to be protected from a variety of dangers. Above all, he is exposed to the danger that this stronger person will show his superiority in the form of punishment. At the beginning, therefore, what is bad is whatever causes one to be threatened with loss of love. For fear of that loss, one must avoid it. This, too, is the reason why it makes little difference whether one has already done the bad thing or only intends to do it. In either case, the danger only sets in if and when the authority discovers it, and in either case, the authority would behave the same way. This state of mind is called a bad conscience, but actually it does not deserve this name, for at this stage the sense of guilt is clearly only fear of loss of love, social anxiety. In small children it can never be anything else, but in many adults too, it has only changed to the extent that the place of the father or the two parents is taken by the larger human community. Consequently, such people habitually allow themselves to do any bad thing which promises them enjoyment, so long as they are sure that the authority will not know anything about it or cannot blame them for it. They are afraid only of being found out. Present-day society has to reckon in general with this state of mind. A great change takes place only when the authority is internalized through the establishment of superego. The phenomena of conscience then reach a higher stage. Actually, it is not until now that we should speak of conscience or a sense of guilt. At this point, too, the fear of being found out comes to an end. The distinction, moreover, between doing something bad and wishing to do it disappears entirely, since nothing can be hidden from the superego, not even thoughts. It is true that the seriousness of the situation from a real point of view has passed away. For the new authority, the superego has no motive that we know of for ill-treating the ego, with which it is intimately bound up. But genetic influence, which leads to the survival of what is past and has been surmounted, makes itself felt in the fact that fundamentally things remain as they were at the beginning. The superego torments the sinful ego with the same feeling of anxiety and is on the watch for opportunities of getting it punished by the external world. So in a sense, the superego is like repeating the trauma that was inflicted by an authority that was looking to regulate the behavior of the ego. To put it in more modern terms. There we go. At the second stage of development, the conscience exhibits a peculiarity which was absent from the first stage and which is no longer easy to account for. For the more virtuous a man is, the more severe and distrustful is its behavior, so that ultimately it is precisely those people who have carried saintliness in the furthest who reproach themselves with the worst sinfulness. This means that virtue forfeits some part of its promised reward. The docile and continent ego does not enjoy the trust of its mentor. It strives in vain, it would seem, to acquire the objection will. To acquire it, the objection will at once be made that these difficulties are superficial ones, and it will be said that a stricter and more vigilant conscience is precisely the hallmark of a moral man. Moreover, when saints call themselves sinners, they are not so wrong, considering the temptations to instinctual satisfaction to which they are exposed in a specially high degree, since, as it is well known, temptations are merely increased by constant frustration, whereas an occasional satisfaction of them causes them to diminish, at least for the time being. The field of ethics, which is so full of problems, presents us with another fact. Namely, the ill luck that is external frustration so greatly enhances the power of the conscience in the superego. As long as things go well with a man, his conscience is lenient and lets the ego do all sorts of things. But when misfortune befalls him, he searches his soul, acknowledges his sinfulness, heightens the demands of his conscience, and imposes abstinences on himself and punishes himself with penances. Whole peoples have behaved in this way and still do. This, however, is easily explained by the original infantile stage of conscience, which, as we see, is not given up after the introjection into the superego, but persists alongside of it and behind it. Fate is regarded as a substitute for the parental agency. If a man is unfortunate, it means he is no longer loved by this highest power and, threatened by such loss of love, he once more bows to the parental representative in his superego, a representative whom, in his days of good fortune, he was ready to neglect. This becomes especially clear where fate is looked upon as in the strictly religious sense of being nothing else than an expression of the divine will. The people of Israel had believed themselves to be the favorite child of God, and when the great Father caused misfortune after misfortune to rain down upon this people of his, they were never shaken in their belief in his relationship to them or questioned his power or righteousness. Instead, they produced the prophets, who held up their sinfulness before them, and out of their sense of guilt they created the over-strict commandments of their priestly religion. It is remarkable how differently a primitive man behaves. If he has met with misfortune, he does not throw the blame on himself, but on his fetish, which has obviously not done its duty, and he gives it a thrashing instead of punishing himself. And here, like anthropologically speaking, a fetish is like a small little totem object, maybe carved out of wood or ivory, that is sort of imbued with a belief in subjectivity. That's sort of the idea that Freud is referring to here, that you might carry a little thing around with you that you treat as a proxy for all of the things that happen to you, and you treat it as an external subject that is responsible for the events that you deal with. No, not a kink, completely different. There's some connection between them, but a fetish in this sense would be like, well, actually, there's kind of a funny thing, but like, you might see those Venus statues or something like that, some kind of little carved icon that refers to something and gives you like a sense of like an external god, sort of. It's like a a more basic idea of religion. It's what actually modern religions would refer to as idolatry, sort of. This idea that this object, like a golden calf or something, is this subject that is responsible for all of the things happening to you. So, like, if it rains and you have a bad day, you're like, it was this thing's fault. Because, it's a coping mechanism, basically. Obviously, it's not your fault. That's pretty silly. It's just kind of an accident of nature. But having something to blame can make it emotionally easier to deal with. I actually would say Freud might be wrong to say that that's a more primitive, because the thing he's describing is more advanced, is this idea that it rained and gave me a bad day because I was bad. I did something wrong, which is, kind of obviously silly, more so than blaming some external thing that you believe is more powerful than you are. But yeah, that's what he's referring to here, not something that's like a kink. Totally separate thing. Yeah. Thus we know of two origins of the sense of guilt, one arising from fear of an authority, and the other later on arising from fear of the superego. The first insists upon a renunciation of instinctual satisfactions. The second, as well as doing this, presses for punishment, since the continuance of the forbidden wishes cannot be concealed from the superego. We have also learned how the severity of the superego, the demands of conscience, is to be understood. It is simply a continuation of the severity of the external authority, to which it has succeeded and which it has in part replaced. Which I think actually, side note, has interesting implications for why somebody's psychology would be constructed this way. And if there wasn't that external authority that was teaching regulation of behavior in this manner, would people's psychology be different? Something to think about. We now see in what relationship the renunciation of instinct stands to the sense of guilt. Originally, renunciation of instinct was when the result... Oh, okay. Oh, no, it's the same thing. Originally, renunciation of instinct, it's just repeating itself, was the result of fear of an external authority. One renounced one's satisfaction in order not to lose its love. If one has carried out that renunciation, one is, as it were, quits with the authority, and no sense of guilt should remain. But with fear of the superego, the case is different. Here, instinctual renunciation is not enough, for the wish persists and cannot be concealed from the superego. Thus, in spite of the renunciation that has been made, a sense of guilt comes about. This constitutes a great economic disadvantage in the erection of a superego, or, as we may put it, the formation of a conscience. Instinctual renunciation now no longer has a completely liberating effect. Virtuous continence, which is like self-control, is no longer rewarded with the assurance of love. A threatened external unhappiness, loss of love and punishment on the part of the external authority, has been exchanged for a permanent internal unhappiness, for the tension of the sense of guilt. It's a pretty grim picture that's being painted here. These interrelations are so complicated and at the same time so important that, at the risk of repeating myself, I shall approach them from yet another angle. The chronological sequence, then, would be as follows. First comes renunciation of the instinct owing to fear of aggression by the external authority. This is, of course, what fear of the loss of love amounts to, for love is a protection against this punitive aggression. After that comes the erection of an internal authority and renunciation of the instinct owing to fear of it, owing to fear of conscience. In this second situation, bad intentions are equated with bad actions, and hence come a sense of guilt and need for punishment. The aggressiveness of conscience keeps up the aggressiveness of the authority. So far, things have no doubt been made clear, but where does this leave room for the reinforcing influence of misfortune, of renunciation imposed from without, and for the extraordinary severity of conscience in the best and most tractable people? We have already explained both these peculiarities of conscience, but we will probably still have an impression that those explanations do not go to the bottom of the matter and leave a residue still unexplained. And here at last an idea comes in which belongs entirely. What? I think it might just be bad grammar. And here at last an idea comes in which belongs entirely to psychoanalysis, and which is foreign to people's ordinary way of thinking. So it's not in which, it's just which belongs to psychoanalysis. This idea is of a sort which enables us to understand why the subject matter was bound to seem so confused and obscure to us. For it tells us that conscience, or more correctly, the anxiety which later becomes conscience, is indeed the cause of instinctual renunciation to begin with, but that later the relationship is reversed. Every renunciation of instinct now becomes a dynamic view of conscience, and every fresh renunciation increases the latter's severity and intolerance. If we could only bring it better into harmony with what we already know about the history of the origin of conscience, we should be tempted to defend the paradoxical statement that confidence is the result of instinctual renunciation, or that instinctual renunciation imposed on us from without creates conscience, which then demands further instinctual renunciation. So you could say that it's like a positive feedback loop, that the more conscientious you are, the stronger your conscience is, the more it tends to push itself to develop more. I think it was probably useful for him to restate that, because it is fairly complex. The contradiction between this statement and what we have previously said about the genesis of conscience is, in point of fact, not so very great, and we see a way of further reducing it. In order to make our exposition easier, let us take as our example the aggressive instinct, and let us assume that the renunciation in question is always a renunciation of aggression. This, of course, is only to be taken as a temporary assumption. The effect of instinctual renunciation on the conscience, then, is that every piece of aggression whose satisfaction of the subject gives up... The effect of instinctual renunciation on the conscience, then, is that every piece of aggression whose satisfaction the subject gives up is taken over by the superego and increases the latter's aggressiveness against the ego, taken up by the superego. This does not harmonize well with the view that the original aggressiveness of conscience is a continuance of the severity of the external authority, and therefore has nothing to do with renunciation. But the discrepancy is removed if we postulate a different derivation for this first installment of the superego's aggressivity. A considerable amount of aggressiveness must be developed in the child against the authority which prevents him from having his desire first, maybe, but nonetheless his most important satisfactions, whatever the kind of instinctual deprivation that is demanded of him may be. German to English translations with these complex grammar constructions. But he is obliged to renounce the satisfaction of this revengeful aggressiveness. He finds his way out of this economically difficult situation with the help of familiar mechanisms. By means of identification, he takes the unattackable authority into himself. The authority now turns into his superego and enters into possession all of the aggressiveness which the child would have liked to exercise against it. So instead of that aggression being directed toward rebellion against the real authority outside, it is directed against the internalized authority of the superego, or it's directed by the internalized authority of the superego against the ego. The child's ego has to content itself with the unhappy role of the authority, the father, who has been thus degraded. Here, as so often, the real situation is reversed. If I were the father and you were the child, I should treat you badly. The relationship between the superego and the ego is a return, distorted by a wish, of the real relationships between the ego, as yet undivided, and an external object that is typical too. But the essential difference is that the original severity of the superego does not, or does not so much, represent the severity which one has experienced from it, the object, or which one attributes to it. It represents rather one's own aggressiveness towards it. If this is correct, we may assert truly that in the beginning, conscience arises through the suppression of an aggressive impulse, and that it is subsequently reinforced by fresh suppressions of the same kind. Which of these two views is correct? The earlier one, which genetically seemed to so unassailable, or the newer one, which rounds off the theory in such a welcome fashion? Clearly, and by the evidence, too, of direct observations, both are justified. They do not contradict each other, and they even coincide at one point. For the child's revengeful aggressiveness will be in part determined by the amount of punitive aggression which he expects from his father. Experience shows, however, that the severity of the superego which a child develops in no way corresponds to the severity of treatment which he has himself met with. The severity of the former seems to be independent of that of the latter. A child who has been very leniently brought up can acquire a very strict conscience, but it would also be wrong to exaggerate this independence. It is not difficult to convince oneself that severity of upbringing does also exert a strong influence on the formation of the child's superego. What it amounts to is that in the formation of the superego and the emergence of conscience, innate constitutional factors and influences from the real environment act in combination. This is not at all surprising. On the contrary, it is a universal etiological condition for all such processes. Let me look up etiological or etiological. Did I just accidentally set my searches to be in Spanish? Weird. Yeah, etiological. Or ideological. Of or related to ideology. Well, that's helpful. Etiology. Spelled with just the E, not the AE. Pathology, the study of the causes of diseases, the cause or the origin of a disease, the study of causation, any study of causes, causation, or causality, as in philosophy, biology, or physics. Okay, I think that's pretty clear then. Talking about tracing the source of the symptoms. And yeah, this comports with science of today, actually, that these are very complex processes that interact with literal genetics, but genetic, as Freud is using it here, in the sense of like personal history, as well as environmental factors and all sorts of other things. And it's not like, just one piece that functions this way. He's probably right here that this sort of superego formation is a product of multiple different factors, because the superego is itself a pretty complicated construct. So this is actually aged pretty well, this part. It can also be asserted that when a child reacts to his first great instinctual frustrations with excessively strong aggressiveness and with a correspondingly severe superego, he is following a phylogenetic model that is going beyond the response that would be currently justified. For the father of prehistoric times was undoubtedly terrible. I don't know about that. And an extreme amount of aggressiveness may be attributed to him. Thus, if one shifts over from individual to phylogenetic development, the differences between the two theories of the genesis of conscience are still further diminished. On the other hand, a new and important difference makes its appearance between these two developmental processes. We cannot get from the assumption that man's sense of guilt springs from the Oedipus complex and was acquired at the killing of the father by the brothers banded together. He did reference that earlier in this text. On that occasion, an act of aggression was not suppressed but carried out. It was the same act of aggression whose suppression in the child is supposed to be the source of his sense of guilt. At this point, I should not be surprised if the reader were to exclaim angrily, "So it makes no difference whether one kills one's father or not. One gets a feeling of guilt in either case." We may take leave to raise a few doubts here. Either it is not true that the sense of guilt comes from the suppressed aggressiveness, or else the whole story of the killing of the father is a fiction and the children of primeval man did not kill their fathers any more often than children do nowadays. Well, maybe. Besides, it is not fiction, but a plausible piece of history. It would be a case of something happening which everyone expects to happen, namely of a person feeling guilty because he really has done something which cannot be justified. And of this event, which is, after all, an everyday occurrence, psychoanalysis has not yet given any explanation. That is true, and we must make good the omission. Nor is there any great secret about the matter. When one has a sense of guilt after having committed a misdeed, and because of it the feeling should more properly be called remorse, it relates only to a deed that has been done, and of course it presupposes that a conscience, the readiness to feel guilty, was already in existence before the deed took place. In other words, that you knew that you were going to, you knew in advance that what you're doing was wrong. You premeditated doing a misdeed. Remorse of this source can therefore never help us to discover the origin of conscience and of the sense of guilt in general. I don't know about that. It doesn't have to. That's the thing about psychology, is it doesn't have to be logical to work, right? People can believe that they're responsible for things because of conscience, even if they didn't have one yet. It's like an injunction that you need to form one so that you don't do these misdeeds. And it can be built on this presupposition that you should have a conscience and that you need to grow one. So I think that that's kind of a small error here, but I want to point it out because it's actually kind of important, that you don't have to be logical in your ideology. It just has the function. Remorse of this sort can therefore never help us to discover the origin of conscience or end of the sense of guilt in general. What happens in these everyday cases is usually this: an instinctual need acquires the strength to achieve satisfaction in spite of the conscience, which is, after all, limited in its strength. And with the natural weakening of the need, owing to its having been satisfied, the former balance of power is restored. Psychoanalysis is thus justified in excluding from the present discussion the case of a sense of guilt due to remorse, however frequently such cases occur and however great their practical importance. I mean, that's not wrong. Except I think that there is some relevance, but I can see where he's getting at with that. But the human sense of guilt goes back to the killing of the primal father. That was, after all, a case of remorse. Are we to assume that at the time a conscience and a sense of guilt were not, as we have presupposed, in existence before the deed? If not, where, in this case, did the remorse come from? There is no doubt that this case should explain the secret of the sense of guilt to us, and put an end to our difficulties, and I believe it does. The remorse was the result of primordial ambivalence of feeling toward the father. His sons hated him, but they loved him too, and after their hatred had been satisfied by their act of aggression, their love came to the fore in their remorse for the deed. It set up the superego by identification with the father, and gave that agency the father's power, as though as a punishment for the deed of aggression they had carried out against him, and created the restrictions which were intended to prevent a repetition of the deed. And since the inclination to aggressiveness against the father was repeated in the following generations, the sense of guilt too persisted, and it was reinforced once more by every piece of aggressiveness that was suppressed and carried over to the superego. Now I think we can at last grasp two things perfectly clearly: the part played by love in the origin of conscience, and the fatal inevitability of the sense of guilt. Whether one has killed one's father or has abstained from doing so is not really the decisive thing. One is bound to feel guilty in either case. For the sense of guilt is an expression of the conflict due to ambivalence, of the eternal struggle between eros and the instinct of destruction or death. This conflict is set going as soon as men are faced with the task of living together, which would also mean that it applies to any social animals. And it may well do. So long as the community assumes no other form than that of the family, the conflict is bound to express itself in the Oedipus complex. And here he does acknowledge that his view is rather Eurocentric and is fixated on, like, the nuclear family. Is bound to express itself in the Oedipus complex to establish the conscience and to create the first sense of guilt. When an attempt is made to widen the community, the same conflict is continued in forms which are dependent on the input, I think, is what was meant there. And if strengthened and results in a further intensification of the sense of guilt, since civilization obeys an internal erotic impulsion which causes human beings to unite in a close-knit group, it can only achieve this aim through an ever-increasing reinforcement of the sense of guilt. What began in relation to the father is completed in relation to the group. If civilization is a necessary course of development from the family to humanity as a whole, then, as a result of the inborn conflict arising from ambivalence of the internal struggle between the trends of love and death, there is inextricably bound up with it an increase of the sense of guilt, which will perhaps reach heights that the individual finds hard to tolerate. One is reminded of the great poet's moving arrangement of the heavenly powers. It's here in German and translated to English as, to the earth, this weary earth. Ye bring us to guilt, ye let us heedless go. Then leave repentance fierce to wring us, a moment's guilt, an age of woe. And we may well heave a sigh of relief at the thought that it is nevertheless vouchsafed to a few to salvage without effort from the whirlpool of their own feelings the deepest truths toward which the rest of us have to find our way through tormenting uncertainty and with restless groping. Yeah, so that's a pretty poetic way of putting it. I think that this is all pretty useful in terms of trying to understand the way that people deal with guilt in a particular context. This is all pretty Eurocentric, and I forget who said it, but that there are pretty significant differences in the way that people think about these things in different parts of the world. For example, that European culture tends to be more focused on guilt, this internal feeling of like, I have done something wrong and I'm responsible to this super ego figure that I have, whereas Asian cultures tend to be more operate with this sort of thing more around shame, where you feel not responsible to an internal super ego, but toward your community and what the real people outside of you will think of you. And so we get into a little bit of a problematic thing here with Freud saying that it's more advanced to internalize this sense of authority, because that implies that Europe is more advanced than other parts of the world in this respect. And I would say that there are differences here, not necessarily that something is more advanced than another. And like I said before with the fetish thing, I think that it's maybe a little naive to put these into some kind of stages of development model. But that kind of comes from this bias that a lot of people have, where they want to think of themselves or their culture as being like the pinnacle of civilization, and that we are the best that humanity has had to offer so far, which drives people toward chauvinism against like foreign cultures, and even against their own cultures in the past, to say we have come forward from there and we've gotten better than them, which is a strong tendency that people have, an emotionally driven one, and something to watch out for. That's not to say that like progress isn't real and it's not possible, but you shouldn't be too hasty to make those judgments and to assume that you've gotten better, because it can blind you to ways that you have not gotten better or even gotten worse. And it can be pretty intolerant when you're comparing people who exist currently. All right, this is hold on, I'm pretty sure this is chapter 8. I think I just have this mislabeled. Yeah, that's labeled as 7. 6, 7, 7, but this is actually 8. I'm gonna take a quick drink here. All right, and then this is not much, there's not too much left of this, like 8 pages. Yeah, roughly. And it's about 3 o'clock, so plenty of time. Chapter 8. Having reached the end of his journey, the author must ask his readers forgiveness for not having been a more skillful guide. Oh, shut up. Just stop it. And for not having spared them empty stretches of road and troublesome detours. There is no doubt that it could have been done better. I will attempt late in the day to make some amends. In the first place, I suspect that the reader has the impression that our discussions of the sense of guilt disrupt the framework of this essay, that they take up too much space so that the rest of its subject matter, which they are not always closely connected. Yeah. Uh-oh. I think I might need to fix my audio. Sounded like something messed up there a little. Alright, that should be fixed. But they take up too much space so that the rest of the subject matter with which they are not always closely connected is pushed to one side. This may have spoilt the structure of my paper, but it corresponds faithfully to my intention to represent the sense of guilt as the most important problem in the development of civilization, and to show that the price we pay for our advance in civilization is a loss of happiness through the heightening of the sense of guilt. Well, I don't mean he made a pretty good case about how this is particular to the structure that we currently have, and like I said, there's alternative ways of doing things, so maybe that's not a necessary feature. Maybe that's just a bug or a part of the particular civilization that he comes from. I mean, a lot has been said about like Christianity and guilt, so that might be something to consider here. The price we pay for advanced civilization is a loss of happiness through the heightening of the sense of guilt. And then there's a footnote for that. I'll get to that in a second. Anything that still sounds strange about that statement, which is the final conclusion of our investigation, can probably be traced to the quite peculiar relationship, as yet completely unexplained, which the sense of guilt has to our consciousness. In the common case of remorse, which we regard as normal, this feeling makes itself clearly enough perceptible to consciousness. Indeed, we are accustomed to speak of a consciousness of guilt instead of a sense of guilt. This is a long paragraph. Okay. I'll continue that after I read the footnote. So the footnote is to... it corresponds faithfully to my intention to represent the sense of guilt as the most important problem in the development of civilization, and to show that the price we pay for our advance in civilization is a loss of happiness through the heightening of the sense of guilt. Footnote is, thus consciousness does make cowards of us all. Thus conscience does make cowards of us all. That the education of young people at present day conceals from them the part which sexuality will play in their lives is not only the reproach which we are obliged to make against it. Is not the only reproach we are obliged to make against it. Its other sin is that it does not prepare them for the aggressiveness of which they are destined to become the objects. In sending the young out into life with such a false psychological orientation, education is behaving as though one were to equip people starting on a polar expedition with summer clothing and maps of the Italian lakes. In this it becomes evident that a certain misuse is being made of ethical demands. You don't say. The strictness of those demands would not do so much harm if education were to say, this is how men ought to be, in order to be happy and to make others happy, but you have to reckon on their not being like that. Instead of this, the young are made to believe that everyone else fulfills those ethical demands, that is, that everyone else is virtuous. It is on this that the demand is based that the young too shall become virtuous. I mean, where's the lie there? And see, this is kind of why it's frustrating that he doesn't go into more of a critique and saying like, hey, maybe this isn't the only way that you could structure civilization. Maybe there's like alternatives, maybe even better alternatives. Yeah. But he kind of conflates this particular civilization with the general concept. I'll reread from where the footnote was. So here. Anything that still sounds strange about that statement, which is the final conclusion of our investigation, can probably be traced to the quite peculiar relationship, as yet completely unexplained, which the sense of guilt has to our consciousness. In the common case of remorse, which we regard as normal, this feeling makes itself clearly enough perceptible to consciousness. Indeed, we are accustomed to speak of a consciousness of guilt instead of a sense of guilt. Our study of the neuroses, to which after all we owe the most valuable pointers to an understanding of normal conditions, brings us up against some contradictions. In one of those affections, obsessional neurosis, the sense of guilt makes itself noisily heard in consciousness. It dominates the clinical picture in the patient's life as well, and it hardly allows anything else to appear alongside of it. But in most other cases and forms of neurosis, it remains completely unconscious, without on that account producing any less important effects. Our patients do not believe us when we attribute an unconscious sense of guilt to them. In order to make ourselves at all intelligible to them, we tell them of an unconscious need for punishment, in which the sense of guilt finds expression. But its connection with a particular form of neurosis must not be overestimated. Even in obsessional neurosis, there are types of patients who are not aware of their sense of guilt, who only feel it as a tormenting uneasiness, a kind of anxiety. If they are prevented from carrying out certain actions, it ought to be possible eventually to understand these things, but as yet we cannot. Here perhaps we may be glad to have pointed out that the sense of guilt is at bottom nothing else but a topographical variety of anxiety. In its later phases, it coincides completely with fear of the superego, and the relations of anxiety to consciousness exhibit the same extraordinary variations. Anxiety is always present somewhere or other behind every symptom, but at one time it takes noisy possession of the whole of consciousness, while at another it conceals itself so completely that we are obliged to speak of unconscious anxiety, or if we want to have a clearer psychological conscience, since anxiety is in the first instance simply a feeling, of possibilities of anxiety. That's kind of a head trip, both the complex grammar and what he's saying there. That you have to create like this sort of incorrect model to communicate what you're trying to say. Consequently, it is very conceivable that the sense of guilt produced by civilization is not perceived as such either, and remains to a large extent unconscious, or appears as a sort of malaise, a dissatisfaction for which people seek other motivations. They're seeking explanations because they don't. It's like a fish in water. The fish doesn't know what water is because it's the medium in which it lives. So people don't recognize the guilt that they are steeped in as part of their civilization because it's what they live in. Here we are. Religions, at any rate, have never overlooked the part played in civilization by a sense of guilt. Furthermore, a point which I failed to appreciate elsewhere, they claim to redeem mankind from this sense of guilt, which they call sin. From the manner in which in Christianity this redemption is achieved, by the sacrificial death of a single person who in this manner takes upon himself a guilt that is common to everyone, we have been able to infer what the first occasion may have been on which this primal guilt, which was also the beginning of civilization, was acquired. It's also really funny to me that he'll talk explicitly about Christianity as being the original point of this guilt, but then kind of attribute it to as like a general feature of human civilization, like these complex developed societies, even though most of the people living in those things are not Christians. Though it cannot be of great importance, it may not be superfluous to elucidate the meaning of a few words such as superego, conscience, sense of guilt, need for punishment, and remorse, which we have often perhaps used too loosely and interchangeably. They all relate to the same state of affairs, but denote different aspects of it. The superego is an agency which has been inferred by us, a conscience and conscience is a function which we ascribe, among other functions, to that agency. This function consists in keeping a watch over the actions and intentions of the ego and judging them, and exercising its censorship. The sense of guilt, the harshness of the superego, is thus the same thing as the severity of the conscience. It is the perception which the ego has of being watched over in this way, the assessment of the tension between its own strivings and the demands of the superego. The fear of this critical agency, a fear which is at the bottom of the whole relationship, the need for punishment, is an instinctual manifestation on the part of the ego. I think it meant to be on the part of the ego, but it says tile instead of the. On the part of the ego, which has become masochistic under the influence of a sadistic superego. It is a portion, that is to say, of the instinct towards internal destruction present in the ego, employed for forming an erotic attachment to the superego. We ought not to speak of a conscience until a superego is demonstrably present. As to a sense of guilt, we must admit that it is in existence before the superego, and therefore before conscience too. At that time, it is the immediate expression of fear of the external authority, a recognition of the tension between the ego and that authority. It is the direct derivative of the conflict between the need for the authority's love and the urge towards instinctual satisfaction, whose inhibition produces the inclination to aggression. The superimposition of these two strata of the sense of guilt, one coming from fear of external authority, the other from the fear of the internal authority, has hampered our insight into the position of conscience in a number of ways. Remorse is a general term for the ego's reaction to it in a case of sense of guilt. It contains in little altered form the sensory material of the anxiety which is operating behind the sense of guilt. It is itself a punishment and can include the need for punishment. Thus, remorse too can be older than conscience. Now we're getting a little weird and complicated. All right. I'm not going to linger on it though. Nor will it do any harm if we once more review the contradictions which have for a while perplexed us during our inquiry. Thus, at one point, the sense of guilt was the consequence of acts of aggression that had been abstained from. But at another point, and precisely at its historical beginning, the killing of the father, it was the consequence of an act of aggression that had been carried out. But a way out of this difficulty was found. For the institution of the internal authority, the superego altered the situation radically. Before this, the sense of guilt coincided with remorse. We may remark incidentally that the term remorse should be reserved for the reaction after the act of aggression has actually been carried out. After this, owing to the omniscience of the superego, the difference between an aggression intended and an aggression carried out lost its force. Henceforward, a sense of guilt could be produced not only by an act of violence that is actually carried out, as all the world knows, but also by one that is merely intended, as psychoanalysis has discovered. Irrespectively of this alteration in the psychological situation, the conflict arising from ambivalence, the conflict between the two primal instincts, leaves the same result behind. We are tempted to look here for the solution of the problem of the varying relation in which the sense of guilt stands to consciousness. It might be thought that a sense of guilt arising from remorse for an evil deed must always be conscious, whereas a sense of guilt arising from the perception of an evil impulse may remain unconscious. But the answer is not so simple as that. Obsessional neurosis speaks energetically against it. The second contradiction concerned the aggressive energy with which we suppose the superego to be endowed. According to one view, that energy merely carries on the punitive energy of the external authority and keeps it alive in the mind, while according to the other view, it consists, on the contrary, of one's own aggressive energy which has not been used and which one now directs against that inhabiting authority. And then the third view that it's a combination of both. The first view seemed to fit in better with the history, and the second with the theory of the sense of guilt. Closer selection has resolved this apparently irreconcilable contradiction almost too completely. What remained as the essential and common factor was that in each case we were dealing with an aggressiveness which had been displaced inwards. Clinical observation, moreover, allows us in fact to distinguish two sources for the aggressiveness which we attribute to the superego. One or the other of them exercises the stronger effect in any given case, but as a general rule they operate in unison. So that's like another layer, is that they both exist, but they also vary in the degree to which they're functioning, which kind of makes it a more effective system to have basically redundancy there, where you've got two different ways it can work. This is, I think, the place at which to put forward this for serious consideration a view which I have earlier recommended for provisional acceptance. In the most recent analytic literature, a predilection is shown for the idea that any kind of frustration, any thwarted instinctual satisfaction results or may result in a heightening of the sense of guilt. A great theoretical simplification will, I think, be achieved if we regard this as applying only to the aggressive instincts, and little will be found to contradict this assumption. For how are we to account, on dynamic and economic grounds, for an increase in the sense of guilt appearing in place of an unfulfilled erotic demand? This only seems possible in a roundabout way if we suppose, that is, that the prevention of the prevention of our erotic satisfaction calls up a piece of aggressiveness against the person who has interfered with the satisfaction, and that this aggressiveness has itself to be suppressed in turn. But if this is so, it is after all only the aggressiveness which is transformed into a sense of guilt by being suppressed and made over to the superego. I am convinced that many processes will admit of a simpler and clearer exposition if the findings of psychoanalysis with regard to the derivation of the sense of guilt are restricted to the aggressive instincts. Examination of the clinical material gives us no unequivocal answer here, because, as our hypothesis tells us, the two classes of instinct hardly ever appear in a pure form, isolated from each other, but an investigation of extreme cases would probably point the direction I anticipate. Again, very scientific in the way he's looking at this. I am tempted to extract a first advantage from this more restricted view of the case by applying it to the process of repression. As we have learned, neurotic symptoms are, in their essence, substitutive satisfactions for unfulfilled sexual wishes. In the course of our analytic work, we have discovered, to our surprise, that perhaps every neurosis conceals a quota of unconscious sense of guilt, which in its turn fortifies the symptoms by making use of them as a punishment. It now seems plausible to formulate the following proposition. When an instinctual trend undergoes repression, its libidinal elements are turned into symptoms, and its aggressive components into a sense of guilt. Even if this proposition is only an average approximation of the truth, it is worthy of our interest. So, let's see. That's a very important point, so I want to summarize it. When you repress an instinct, the libido side of things, the libidinal elements, become symptoms, and the aggressive ones become guilt. So basically, it's like the libidinal things you're driven to do to satisfy this eros, they sort of try to find another way out. When you repress this part, it leaks out somewhere else. But with the aggressive ones, it doesn't leak out. It becomes this like feeling of guilt here, which is self-reinforcing. So whereas repressing the libido tends to be more of a failure and tends to result in like acting out in this sense, he's saying that repressing aggression just leads you to repress aggression even more strongly, since aggression is like driven by like ego is well, not sense, but it is driven by ego desires according to Freud, which means that Sorry, I was looking at the chat. Which means that it doesn't have this libidinal energy behind it. And so maybe it's that it doesn't really have this drive pushing it out to come back after being repressed. And instead just reinforces this process of repression. Some readers of this work may further have an impression that they have heard the formula of struggle between Eros and the death instinct too often. It was alleged to characterize the process of civilization which mankind undergoes, but it was also brought into connection with the development of the individual, and in addition, it was said to have revealed the secret of organic life in general. We cannot, I think, avoid going into the relations of these three processes to one another. The repetition of the same formula is justified by the consideration that both the process of human civilization and the development of the individual are also vital processes, which is to say that they must share in the most general characteristic of life. On the other hand, evidence of the presence of this general characteristic fails for the very reason of its general nature, to help us to arrive at any differentiation between the processes, so long as it is not narrowed down by special qualifications. We can only be satisfied, therefore, if we assert that the process of civilization is a modification which the vital processes which the vital process experiences under the influence of a task that is set it by Eros and instigated by Ananke. God damn it, what's Ananke? By the exigencies of reality, and that this task is one of uniting separate individuals into a community bound together by libidinal ties. Alright, what's Ananke? Well, that's not helpful. Small natural satellite of the planet Jupiter. Alright, gotta just search for that instead of putting it in the dictionary. Okay, Ananke and Kronos are mates. Okay, so this is it's a reference to the Oedipus complex then. Set by Eros and instigated by Ananke. So, right. Kronos being the father that's killed by the siblings. Ananke being the mother in that context. So basically fulfilling the role of the mother in the sort of, I guess, archetypal psychoanalysis. The archetypal mother. Uniting separate individuals into a community bound together by libidinal ties. When, however, we look at the relation between the process of human civilization and the development or educative process of individual human beings, we shall conclude without much hesitation that the two are very similar in nature, if not the very same process applied to different kinds of object. The process of the civilization of the human species is, of course, an abstraction of a higher order than is the development of the individual, and is therefore harder to apprehend in concrete terms. Nor should we pursue analogies to an obsessional extreme, but in view of the similarity between the aims of the two processes, in the one case, the integration of a separate individual into a human group, and in the other case, the creation of a unified group out of many individuals, we cannot be surprised at the similarity between the means employed and the resultant phenomena. Yeah, almost like a kind of like historical materialist thing there. Stages of development thing that, like, civilization or like the more complex development of human society is kind of an extension of these natural processes. It's pretty frustrating reading this book, thinking that, you know, would have been nice if Marx was injected a little bit more into this, because he gets really close at times. In view of its exceptional importance, we must not long postpone the mention of one feature which distinguishes between the two processes. In the developmental process of the individual, the program of the pleasure principle, which consists in finding the satisfaction of happiness, is retained as the main aim. integration in or adaptation to a human community appears as a scarcely avoidable condition which must be fulfilled before this aim of happiness can be achieved. If it could be done without that condition, it would perhaps be preferable. To put it in other words, the development of the individual seems to us to be a product of the interaction between two urges: the urge toward happiness, which we usually call egoistic, and the urge toward union with others in the community, which we call altruistic. Neither of these descriptions goes much below the surface. In the process of individual development, as we have said, the main accent falls mostly on the egoistic urge, or the urge toward happiness, while the other urge, which may be described as a cultural one, is usually content with the role of imposing restrictions. But in the process of civilization, things are different. Here, by far, the most important thing is the aim of creating a unity out of the individual human beings. It is true that the aim of happiness is still there, but it is pushed into the background. It almost seems as if the creation of a great human community would be most successful if no attention had to be paid to the happiness of the individual. I think I might have seen something like that before. I might have seen that dynamic being put into play. The developmental process of the individual can thus be expected to have special features of its own, which are not reproduced in the process of human civilization. It is only insofar as the first of these processes has union with the community as its aim that it need coincide with the second process. So, like, being, as weird as it sounds, being socialized as an individual, which is like kind of contradictory, would just be different. Just as a planet revolves around, which is to say probably wouldn't happen at all. Just as a planet revolves around a central body, as well as rotating on its own axis, so the human individual takes part in the course of development of mankind at the same time as he pursues his own path in life. But through our dull eyes, the play of forces in the heavens seem fixed in a never-changing order. In the field of organic life, we can still see how the forces contend with one another, and how the effects of the conflict are continually changing. So also the two urges, the one towards personal happiness and the other towards union with the other human beings, must struggle with each other in every individual, and so also the two processes of individual and cultural development must stand in hostile opposition to each other and mutually dispute the ground. But this struggle between the individual and society is not a derivative of the contradiction, probably an irreconcilable one, between the primal instincts of eros and death. It is a dispute within the economics of the libido, comparable to the contest concerning the distribution of libido between ego and objects, and it does admit of an eventual accommodation in the individual, as it may be hoped. It will also do in the future of civilization, however much that civilization may oppress the life of the individual today. The analogy between the process of civilization and the path of individual development may be extended in an important respect. Oh, no, there should be a period there. In an important respect. It can be asserted that the community too evolves a superego, under whose influence cultural development proceeds. It would be a tempting task for anyone who has a knowledge of human civilizations to follow out this analogy in detail. I will confine myself to bringing forward a few striking points. The superego of an epoch of civilization has an origin similar to that of an individual. It is based on the impression left behind by the personalities of great leaders, men of overwhelming force of mind, or men in whom one of the human impulsions has found its strongest and purest, and therefore often its most one-sided expression. In many instances, the analogy goes still further, in that during their lifetime these figures were often enough, even if not always, mocked and maltreated by the others, and even dispatched in a cruel fashion. In the same way, indeed, the primal father did not attain divinity until long after he had met his death by violence. The most arresting example of this fateful conjunction is to be seen in the figure of Jesus Christ. if indeed that figure is not a part of mythology, which called it into being from an obscure memory of that primal event. Probably a mixture of both. Another point of agreement between the cultural and the individual superego is that the former, just like the latter, sets up strict ideal demands, disobedience to which is visited with fear of conscience. Here indeed we come across the remarkable circumstance that the mental processes concerned are actually more familiar to us and more accessible to consciousness as they are seen in the group than they can be in the individual man. In him, when tension arises, it is only the aggressiveness of the superego which, in the form of reproaches, makes itself noisily heard. Its action demands often remain unconscious in the background. If we bring them to conscious knowledge, we find that they coincide with the precepts of the prevailing cultural superego. At this point, the two processes, that of the cultural development of the group and that of the cultural development of the individual, are, as it were, always interlocked. For that reason, some of the manifestations and properties of the superego can be more easily detected in its behavior in the cultural community, than in the separate individual. The cultural superego has developed its ideals and set up its demands. Among the latter, those which deal with the relations of human beings to one another are comprised under the heading of ethics. People have at all times set the greatest value on ethics, as though they expected that it in particular will produce especially important results. And it does in fact deal with the subject which can easily be recognized as the sorest spot in every civilization. Ethics is thus to be regarded as a therapeutic attempt, as an endeavor to achieve, by means of a command of the superego, something which has so far not been achieved by means of any other cultural activities. As we already know, the problem before us is how to get rid of the greatest hindrance to civilization, namely the constitutional inclination of human beings to be aggressive toward one another. And for that very reason, we are especially interested in what is probably the most recent of the cultural commands of the superego, the commandment to love one's neighbor as oneself. In our research into and therapy of a neurosis, we are led to make two reproaches against the superego of the individual. In the severity of its commands and prohibitions, it troubles itself too little about the happiness of the ego, in that it takes insufficient amount of the resistance against obeying them, of the instinctual strength of the id in the first place, and of the difficulties presented by the real external environment in the second. Consequently, we are very often obliged, for therapeutic purposes, to oppose the superego, and we endeavor to lower its demands. Exactly the same objections can be made against the ethical demands of the cultural superego. It does, too, not trouble itself enough about the facts of the mental constitution of human beings. It issues a command and does not ask whether it is possible for people to obey it. On the contrary, it assumes that a man's ego is psychologically capable of anything that is required of it, that his ego has unlimited mastery over his id. This is a mistake. And even in what are known as normal people, the id cannot be controlled beyond certain limits. It's also not just about controlling the id, it's also about mastering the external world. This is the whole pull up your bootstraps mentality here. Making demands that cannot be met. And that's culturally superego, by the way. This is a mistake, and even in what are known as normal people, the id cannot be controlled beyond certain limits. If more is demanded of a man, a revolt will be produced in him, or a neurosis, or he will be made unhappy. Or like an external revolt. A revolt against the cultural superego. Embodied in like a revolution. Revolt will be produced in him, or a neurosis, or he will be made unhappy. The commandment, love thy neighbor as thyself, the strongest defense against human aggressiveness and an excellent example of the unpsychological proceedings of the cultural superego. I got some gripes about his opinion on that. I think he kind of misses the hack that love thy neighbor as thyself is doing. It's actually very clever. But anyway, on psychological proceedings of the cultural superego, the commandment is impossible to fulfill. Such an enormous inflation of love can only lower its value, not get rid of the difficulty. Civilization pays no attention to all this. It merely admonishes us that the harder it is to obey the precept, the more meritorious it is to do so. No, see, that's like Protestant work ethic shit. That's very particular. That's like very particular to context. Although I guess like Catholic guilt is part of that too. But anyone who follows such a precept in present-day civilization only puts himself at a disadvantage vis-a-vis the person who disregards it. What a potent obstacle to civilization aggressiveness must be if the defense against it can cause as much unhappiness as aggressiveness itself. Natural ethics, as it is called, has nothing to offer here except the narcissistic satisfaction of being able to think of oneself better than others. At this point, the ethics based on religion introduces its promises of a better afterlife. But so long as virtue is not rewarded here on earth, ethics will, I fancy, preach in vain. I too think it quite certain that a real change in the relations of human beings to possessions would be of more help in this direction than any ethical commands. Oh, he's taken the Stirnerite turn here. Did Freud read Stirner? That's hilarious. I too think it quite certain that a real change in the relations of human beings to possessions would be of more help in this direction than any ethical commands. But the recognition of this fact among socialists has been obscured and made useless for practical purposes by a fresh idealistic misconception of human nature. Alright, so let's put aside the dumb human nature thing for a second. The idea of like people becoming possessions is like what Stirner described as other people being like my property and like sort of the domain of my world, and treating other people as like something that you own in a sense of like you interact with and that you can do with as you please. But he also carries with that a consciousness that, you know, people are not just objects, but are subjects and are capable of responding to how they're treated. So there is sort of like a self-awareness and a desire to make people be nice to you, since you want your property to, you know, serve you well. So there's an interesting logic here that Freud, I don't think is actually invoking, but is kind of skirting alongside. But yeah, I think he might also be dipping into some bourgeois capitalist mentality here about how turning everything into property and commodity is actually the highest stage of development. And again, he's kind of seeming to be unfamiliar with real socialist critiques of things, using like human nature arguments. But that might be, you know, this is Germany in 1930, so he might just be trying to avoid persecution. So occasionally throwing in those jabs at socialists. I believe the line of thought which seeks to trace in the phenomena of cultural development the part played by a superego promises still further discoveries. I hasten to come to a close. But there is one question which I can hardly evade. If the development of civilization has such a far-reaching similarity to the development of the individual, and if it employs the same methods, may we not be justified in reaching the diagnosis that, under the influence of cultural urges, some civilizations, or some epochs of civilization, possibly the whole of mankind, have become neurotic? Well, I think Lacan seems to think that most people are neurotic, so perhaps. An analytic dissection of such neuroses, of course, maybe this is where he's getting that, right? An analytic dissection of such neuroses might lead to therapeutic recommendations which could lay claim to great political interest. Also, I think this is a really good point to say that, like, society as a whole might be operating in a way that's disordered. And having read this, it would be good to go back and read the rest of the piece and read that component into everything, because there's a whole lot of kind of essentializing of society, that this is the way things are or must be. So, worth thinking about. An analytic dissection of such neuroses might lead to therapeutic recommendations which could lay claim to great practical interest. I would not say that an attempt of this kind to carry psychoanalysis over to the cultural community was absurd or doomed to be fruitless, but we should have to be very cautious and not forget that, after all, we are only dealing with analogies, and that it is dangerous not only with men but also with concepts to tear them from the sphere in which they have originated and been evolved. Moreover, the diagnosis of communal neuroses is faced with a special difficulty. In an individual neurosis, we take as our starting point the contrast that distinguishes the patient from his environment, which is assumed to be normal. For a group of all whose members are affected by one and the same disorder, no such background could exist. It would have to be found elsewhere, like in human nature or something. As regards to the therapeutic application of our knowledge, what would be the use in the most correct analysis of social neuroses, since no one possesses authority to impose such a therapy upon a group? Well, I mean, isn't most of the work recovering from this kind of thing done by the person who's suffering from it, just with guidance from somebody who has that authority as an expert? Perhaps you could have somebody who is a public figure acting in the role of therapist for a whole society. Since no one possesses authority to impose such therapy upon the group. But in spite of all these difficulties, we may expect that one day someone will venture to embark upon a pathology of cultural communities. For a wide variety of reasons, it is very far from my intention to express an opinion on the value of human civilization. The value of human civilization. So he's acknowledging here that he's just kind of neutrally describing it, and maybe it's not a good thing. Not necessarily good or bad, just something that is. But it should also be injected that this is a particular type of civilization he's deconstructing here. It does not necessarily apply to all of them. And also definitely does not necessarily apply to all of human society, which is not necessarily all under the umbrella of civilization. I have endeavored to guard myself against the enthusiastic prejudice which holds that our civilization is the most precious tiling that we possess or could acquire, and that its path will necessarily lead to heights of unimagined perfection. I can at least listen without indignation to the critic who is of the opinion that when one surveys the aims of cultural endeavor and the means it employs, one is bound to come to the conclusion that the whole effort is not worth the trouble, and that the outcome of it can only be a state of affairs which the individual will be unable to tolerate. My impartiality is made all the easier to me by knowing very little about all these things. He got a point. He's got a point. It's easy to be impartial if you recognize that you don't really know what's going on, and you can say that you don't know what you're talking about. One thing only do I know for certain, and that is that man's judgment of value follows directly his wishes for happiness, that accordingly they are an attempt to support his illusions with arguments. I should find it very understandable if someone were to point out the obligatory nature of the course of human civilization, and were to say, for instance, that the tendencies to a restriction of sexual life, or to the institution of a humanitarian ideal at the expense of natural selection, were developmental trends which cannot be averted or turned aside, and to which it is best for us to yield as though they were necessities of nature. I know, too, the objection that can be made against this, to the effect that in the history of mankind, trends such as these, which were considered unsurmountable, have often been thrown aside and replaced by other trends. Thus, I have not the courage to rise up before my fellow men as a prophet and bow to their reproach that I can offer them no consolation. For at bottom, that is what they are all demanding. The wildest revolutionaries no less passionately than the most virtuous believers. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think a lot of people are I for one am looking for further exploration into this, so that we can maybe find an answer at some point. That's the scientific process. You don't get there through received wisdom that's downloaded into your brain all at once. You get it through exploration and experimentation. And I think a lot of people are okay with that. The fateful question for the human species seems to be whether and to what extent their cultural development will succeed in mastering the disturbance of their communal life by the human instinct of aggression and self-destruction. It may be that in this respect, precisely the present time deserves a special interest. Men have gained control over the forces of nature to such an extent that with their help they would have no difficulty in exterminating one another to the last man. He had no idea how true this was. Again, this is 1930, so before nukes. They know this, and hence comes a large part of their current interest, their unhappiness and their mood of anxiety. And now it is to be expected that the other of the two heavenly powers, eternal Eros, will make an effort to assert himself in the struggle with his eternally immortal adversary. But who can foresee with what success and with what result? The final sentence was added in 1931, when the menace of Hitler was already beginning to be apparent. Yeah, again, published 1930 in Germany by Sigmund Freud, or written by Sigmund Freud. I don't know who published it. Yeah. All right, so that's the end of Civilization and Its Discontents, chapters 6 through 8. And in time. Oh yeah, that's funny. Just as I'm ending, they're saying we might want to make sure that I'm done with the stream, and I am done. Yeah, I see the Matrix chat. All right, so yeah, just as I got to the end there, that was a good time. I enjoyed that. I don't know. I'm curious to see if people will tune in for book readings like that. I'd like to read more theory and maybe some like history and stuff, if people enjoy that. But yeah, I don't have anything else for this. I'm gonna go take a break before I get to the reading group. I'm doing that in a bit, either like an hour and 15 minutes or 2 hours and 15 minutes. I think that's the timing that they're talking about. Yeah, so like an hour and 15 minutes, 21 UTC. Yeah. So yeah, that was good. I'd like to do that again, although not because I didn't have time to do it earlier. I'd like to be doing like a second reading or something. But that'll be it for this stream. Thanks to everybody for tuning in. I don't know, is there still stuff going on with the protests over in the Movie Night channel? Oh shit, did I not make this? I didn't make this channel public, did I? Oh, I'm a dumbass. Hold on. List channel publicly. There we go. Forgot to list the SciTube channel publicly. Alright, anyway, I think that there's stuff still going on with Movie Night. There's a protest in London, so if anybody wants to tune into that. That looks like that's no longer live. Maybe people stop watching. Nope. It's looking like live streams are over. Let me see if any of them are live. Nope, all the ones that are on there are no longer live. But there might still be something going on if somebody adds one. But yeah, I'm done with this. I'll be back Monday with the news. I'm not sure what day next week I'm going to take off, but I will be doing Monday. So yeah, enjoy the rest of the weekend. Check out the reading group if you're interested. I'll post a link. I'll post a link to the thread with the list of PDFs if anybody is interested. In SciTube and in Twitch, and on YouTube, just in case people want to go check all that out. It's got a big list of PDFs, and then we're discussing the stuff we're going to read. So if this was of interest to you, you might want to check that out too. That's going to be it for me. Have a good weekend. You know, instead of saying like, comment, and subscribe, I think that I should do like the lefty version of that. So remember to go agitate, educate, and organize.
That's all, folks.